Welcome to The Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and today I talk to a old college friend, Dr. Justin Garcia, who is the executive director of the Kinsey Institute, which is like, you might have seen the movie about this, but is like the first and most prominent higher ed institution that studies relationships and sex in America. He's also the author of a wonderful new book that we talk about that's all about trends in intimacy and sex. He also advises the Match Group, the dating app company that has Tinder, Match.com, et cetera. And he puts out, he's part of a team that puts out a report every year on trends in dating and sex in America. So we talk about all of those things. And so I think you're going to love this interview. A couple just random things in my notebook right now. I saw this movie over the weekend called Obsession, which actually in some ways is on topic. It's somewhat about dating. It's a horror movie. I'm not a big horror movie person, but this movie was insane. It was both a very good movie and very disturbing movie, maybe the most disturbing movie I've ever seen. It's up there with The Audition. If any of you have seen the Japanese movie, The Audition, and it might even be more disturbing than that. I won't say too much about it other than what the premise is that you get in the first couple minutes, which is it's about this teenager who he gets this sort of trinket that is like a make-a-wish type of thing. And he makes a wish that this girl that he really likes would love him more than anything in the world. And the movie's all about the unintended consequences of that wish. And it is freaky. It was so weird and disturbing that when the movie was over, everybody in the theaters just kind of sat there. Nobody got up right away. And so I recommend it. It is disturbing, but it also is incredible. The director, I think, is in his 20s, like mid-20s, and very talented guy. I think it's a pretty amazing watch. Second is if you go to realravigupta.com Substack, you could subscribe for free. I posted a long article last week about the sort of implications of this Hassan Parker debate for Democrats. And it's gotten more engagement and a bigger debate than anything I've ever posted before. So you could jump in there. Tomorrow, I'm going to be posting a article all about the boxer Alexander Usyk, the Ukrainian boxer, and what we all can learn from the way that he trains and the way that he goes about his business. So I'm going to tack back towards the learning content, which is what I mostly write on that Substack. And so there's a lot I could talk about that's in the news. I actually have Graham Plattner, the candidate for Senate in Maine, coming on Majority 54 later this afternoon. We only have him for about 30 minutes in a joint interview, so I'm not sure how many good questions I'll be able to get in, but I'm going to try my best. But on Majority 54, and then probably here on this podcast at some point in the next week, I'm going to dive into this just flurry of news about Trump's deal with the Justice Department and this sort of slush fund that he's created for people who've been quote unquote aggrieved by the Justice Department. I have a lot to say about that and his trading activity and the election results from last night. So I'll either put something here later this week or next week I'll dive even more into it. So stay tuned for more on that. But without further ado, let's get into my interview with Dr. Justin Garcia. Dr. Justin Garcia, welcome to the podcast.
Thrilled to be with you. Thanks for having me.
It's been, 25 years? No.
Just about, I think. A little less. 21 maybe?
21, let's think. 2005. Yeah, 21 years.
Oh my gosh.
You and I were resident assistants together at Cayuga Hall. Am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah, that's
College in the Woods, Binghamton University. And I've been following your career from afar. Very proud of you.
Likewise.
Yeah, we went to Binghamton together in the early 2000s. And you have made quite a career. And I want to talk to you today about sort of three sort of strains of your career. One is your role as an advisor to the Match Group, which creates a bunch of dating apps. One is as the director of the Kinsey Institute. And then 3 is as an author. And those all come together. Obviously, those are not distinct or fully compartmentalized. Let's start with the Match study, because I think that just gives us some data to work with here about where things are. I know that from what I understand, you advise the Match Group, they have which dating apps? Tinder, I imagine, right?
Yeah, Match Group owns a lot of the popular dating apps. So Match Group is a parent organization. They have Match.com, Tinder, Hinge, Plenty of Fish, OkCupid, Our Time for people 50 and older. So there's a lot that fits inside their umbrella.
And you are part of a team that helps them put together a study that they release every year. And the most recent publicly available one was from about a year ago, which
Mhm.
makes me suspect that you're sitting on some data that's about to be released in a couple weeks. So
You're right.
I don't expect you to present that data today, but to the extent anything I say contradicts something feel free to fill it in.
Sure.
But we have data from last year that
Mhm.
looks at singles in America, and I think it looks at singles of all ages, right?
Mhm. Yeah, we've been doing the study since 2010, and Match with my late colleague, the anthropologist Helen Fisher, and then with my collaborator Amanda Gesselman. So we've got this is our 15th year of data. We skipped a year with COVID, and every year we collect a sample about 5,000 U.S. singles. They're not Match users. It's a national, demographically representative sample. So we have 18-year-olds, 90-year-olds, different race, religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, parts of the country, but they're all single.
And if you think about that data, what are some sort of counterintuitive findings that have endured for you over the years?
Yeah, I think there's some that are interesting, and I think probably we're all kind of aware of, even if we don't always like it. So one being that the most common way that singles today meet a date is through apps and websites. It far outpaces friends, religious organizations, clubs, bars. We have this idea that we can go to a bar and meet someone, but in fact, very small percentage of singles are doing that. Well, I shouldn't say a larger number are trying it, but how often it lands, it's around 5%, usually between 4 and 6% of meeting a date through a bar or club, where we're over 40% are meeting through an app or website. But you asked counterintuitive, and I have one that I was just talking about, and I love this one because it highlights something we see in the data. Just last year, we asked people about love at first sight. And that number has been on the rise. So 60% of single Americans in our sample believe in love at first sight, not a very significant gender difference, which was interesting. So 6 out of 10 people are walking around think I could just when I see love, I'm gonna know. I'm gonna know it's there. And on the one hand, I think that's really romantic and cute. And on the other hand, I think, oh, that really worries me as someone who studies relationships and courtship and dating. Because I think too many of us are walking around with this idea that we'll just find it, it's just gonna happen, and forget that courtship takes some effort. It takes some, and most importantly, the counterintuitive part that you asked about is that we forget that it also takes second glances. So this idea that 60% of us are walking around believe in love at first sight, but we know that 70% of singles in our sample have fallen in love with someone that they didn't initially think of as a romantic partner, often a friend or a coworker. Half of those people, half of singles in that same year told us that they've fallen in love with someone that they actively didn't think they could be attracted to at first. So that I'm a big advocate of second and third dates for that reason, but it also highlights that our attitudes, our beliefs, like love at first sight, are often misaligned with what we experience in real time when we're out there looking for a pot to our lid.
Well, the extreme example of this you mentioned in your book is arranged marriages, which
Mhm.
are fairly common, as you describe in the book, across time and civilizations, and that the order of operations there is mixed up from the way that we think about it today. We think of it, you fall in love and then you get together, or you develop intimacy and then you get together. Whereas, obviously in an arranged marriage, you have none of that sort of pre-existing context, and then you develop it, which is obviously the more extreme example. I'm not expecting a wave of arranged marriages, but I think what you're saying is be a little bit more patient, right? That's what the data is telling you.
Yeah, exactly. And it also highlights, I think, why matchmaking is on the rise. So people who are using professional and boutique matchmakers, we see that there's an increase in that, particularly in North America. And I think that it's the same case. You have someone who's doing a lot of background work, whether it's an app or a matchmaker, but then it takes time. Partly, one of the things we see in our study is the number one thing singles want in a romantic partner. Singles today, we can get back to arranged marriages because there's a lot to unpack there, but singles today, the number one thing they want in a partner is someone they can trust and confide in. And do you want someone who's intelligent, humorous, attractive, funny, sexually confident? Yeah, all those things are in the top 10 as well. But trust and confide in is the number one. You don't usually learn that from looking at a profile for a few seconds before you swipe. You don't usually learn that from a coffee date for 30 minutes or even an hour. That you really have to pull out. So that's why those second, third dates, getting to know someone, building friendship, it can be really transformative for the way you think about a potential romantic partner. And then ultimately, is that someone you can weather storms with? Is it someone you can trust?
Well, one of the things that shows up in the match data is sort of generational differences. And I think the Institute for Family Studies, I think it's 1 in 3 Gen Z or oh, yeah, only 1 in 3 young adults is actively dating according to them, which I invite you to either confirm or, challenge. But some of the other things that you picked up in the most recent match study, was that 68% of Gen Z want marriage, but only 49% want kids. There's a growth of intentional celibacy among Gen Z.
Mhm.
They're more sexually conservative, with 29% saying sex shouldn't happen outside of a marriage. So is there like, are we seeing like a bit of a sex session as they call it? You say that in the last data you study, I think you said it was waning, the so-called sex session somewhat.
Mhm.
Is that still your impression?
Yeah, I mean, some folks have sort of jokingly referred to Gen Z as the new Victorians in terms of they do appear to have somewhat more conservative attitudes across
And they
the
don't
whole
drink
host.
as much either. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Less alcohol and drug use, less sexual activity, less dating activity, less risk taking, less gambling. I mean, this is true across a lot of domains that we see somewhat less risk taking. And it's why sometimes I've been asked, like, is it really specific to dating? And it doesn't look that way. Even when we ask about burnout, people are reporting burnout in every domain of their life. Young people are reporting less risk taking across a bunch of domains. So what we see is, and I think one of the challenges for depending on how we cut the data and what we ask is, yeah, people are, particularly young people, less are thinking about marriage, lower numbers are thinking about having kids. The thing about that is, and we've known this for a while now, is so much of that is dynamic. So if you're 24 years old, you might say, I don't want kids. And then you meet someone, maybe, and you're in a relationship, maybe, and that dynamic changes what you want. So you might, it's kind of like arousal. We talk about arousal being responsive to particular people and particular situations, particular contexts. We don't all just sort of walk around aroused. Our psychophysiology responds to our environment. And those desires, for connection, for relationships, for kids, for family formation, they're responsive to particular people. So you might say, "I'm not really sure I want kids," and then you're in a relationship for a year and say, "I want kids with you because I think you're a good mother. I think you'd be a great father. I think that we could have this life now that I can imagine." So the challenge with some of these surveys is that it does give us a snapshot of attitudes, but we have to be cautious about how we translate that into necessarily outcomes. Now, that said, we do know that there are changing patterns of relationships and dating and marriage, and so the other shoe can kind of drop. But the question is, how do we make people feel that they can find partners they can trust and confide in? Is there a safety net, a social structured safety net for things like family formation?
Yeah, and one interesting finding is that millennials, which you and I are a part, are having the most sex.
Yeah.
Why? Like, what is going on here? Is it
Mhm.
because of where we are in life? Is it because of sort of 90s sort of libertarian, sort of parenting? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, and in some ways we were the hookup generation, so also
Yes.
seeing, which is aging. And so I think there's a few things. One is for Gen Z, there seem to be more kind of existential weight going on. So people are worried about jobs, they're worried about their careers, they're worried about the economy, they're worried about what's happening in the Middle East, they're worried about what's happening in US politics. What does that have to do with our love and sex lives? Well, one of the ways we can understand our sexual behaviors or even our romantic intentions is that we respond to environments. Our species has responded to its environment for millions of years. So if you're in a high risk environment or a high stress environment, it's not really conducive to any mating behavior. So one way I always think of it is that you don't see two gazelle mating in front of a lion in the natural world. And because if you have a threat physiology. So increasingly people are talking about this sense that there's a kind of generalized anxiety that we have a lot of low level pressures that are weighing on us. For younger generations, that feels heavier. They have debt, student debt, they have questions about careers. There's a lot more uncertainty. High degrees of uncertainty are not conducive to mating in humans or any other sexually reproducing species. So I think that for our generation, when you're a little bit older, yes, there's uncertainty in the world, but we have more ability and skills to navigate it. We tend to have somewhat more financial ability. We tend to have more clarity about careers and education. Maybe many of us are even sort of having our own kids and building our own families. So that's part of what's going on as well. I think it's about how we're interpreting our environment and the risk and the uncertainty. And we've been through waves of uncertainty as well. So in different ways. 9/11, COVID, political crises. after another. So that's one way that we can think of it, how we respond adaptively to our environment. The other is there's broader questions about Gen Z in particular, about the how kind of what's happened post COVID on how young people are socializing. Now there's a lot of hot takes about that and about, impacts of social media and cell phone use, and experts are disagreeing more behind the scenes than is always publicly visible about some of those impacts. And but how is that shaping how is pornography shaping our romantic and sexual lives, particularly for younger people, where it's such a common source of education? Those become harder things to give a definitive answer to because there's still a lot of research. You asked about the sex recession. Yes, research does show we're seeing declines in sexual activity. Early on, that was really an inside baseball thing. Researchers were starting to notice it. There was that big cover story by Kate Julian on the Atlantic magazine, and we were seeing decreases in sexual behavior. The big question for us is, what does it mean? So if there's on average a few less sexual events every year that men and women are experiencing, is it necessarily a problem? And what is it? What is your relationship satisfaction? What is your sexual satisfaction? Those are different measures. And what are the pressures? In one of our studies, we found we had some of the first data that showed that particularly young women, what was their response to changing legislation around Roe v. Wade? If they had rules on average of women who had rules about, like, I wait for a first date or a third date or a fifth date for sex, they were pushing that back. So they were being more cautious about first sex and a new partnership because it just felt riskier. It felt like the consequences were more severe. And in fact, they were. So people, particularly young women, were adaptively responding to a changing socio-political landscape. So that's really I know I sound like I'm in my professor mode, not really answering your question, but it's part because it's kind of hard to really grab onto one particular issue is that it's associated with these shifts. There's a lot that's happening, but I think overall we are adaptively responding to our environmental context.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, it is in the context of overall less risk taking in
Mhm.
general. So
Yeah.
obviously, that's a big trend that sort of extends beyond this one question.
Mhm.
One thing that stood out to me, and you mentioned this data right at the beginning of your book, but we have something like 40% of Americans who are single,
Mhm. Yeah.
which, as I understand it, is both unprecedented from our country's history, but also across cultures and nations, even
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
So put that in context. Like, how unprecedented is this and why?
So throughout, when anthropologists look at population dynamics in different societies, particularly biological anthropologists, we know that in most cases people partner. Some suggestions are around 85% of a population at some point socially monogamously form pair bonds and they have partnerships. So that we have so many adults, over 40%, that are single at any given time, a lot of them moving in and out of romantic and sexual relationships. They're not necessarily single for life, but that highlights just a pattern that's quite different. Now we're seeing it in a lot of
And just to
places.
clarify, single means unmarried here or just not in any relationship?
Yeah, I love that you asked that. So for me, single means not in a romantic relationship, and that's how we define it. Some folks do define it as unmarried. In fact, the census and a lot of demographers would define it as unmarried. The
Well, so
reason I don't
40% of Americans are in no relationship whatsoever right now.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Adults of
Wow.
adult yeah, and it's shocking. I mean, at scale, we're talking about well over 100 million Americans, and that the reason not that I don't like unmarried, I don't use it, is because we also see rising rates of cohabitation. So there could be people in long-term relationships who live with each other who aren't married, and in fact, and in some of our studies, what we find a couple of years with the single study and other studies, we do oversamples, and we've taken samples of people who are married or in relationships. What we find, like on measures of stress and anxiety, that people who are married versus single, people who are married have lower rates of stress, lower rates of anxiety across a bunch of different domains of life. So then one year we said, well, what if we pop in people who are in a relationship but not married, cohabiting, and they fall right in the middle when we look at these rates of stress, anxiety, and other measures of psychological well-being. That says there's something about marriage, about the sort of legal construct of marriage that becomes embodied. That contract does something about how safe we feel in relationships, how connected we feel, how supported we feel. It seems to have some outcomes, and it's also the social weight. My sociologist colleagues would give me a whack for not mentioning that part, but it's also the social weight of what does it mean when you're married, when you get invited to events, when you say, this is my spouse versus this is my, girlfriend. We've lived together for 15 years. That's changing. The sort of stigma or social pressure around that is changing, and it's certainly changed quite a long time ago in lots of parts of Europe, not so much in Asia and Africa and other parts of the world, but we are starting to see more norms around that, particularly in cities. I mean, we're both New Yorkers, we're for a long time have been aware of people who are domestic partners, whether heterosexual or same sex, for 10, 20 years. And that's, but there's a whole lot of other parts of the country where that's still viewed as atypical.
Now, the central thesis of your book is that you kind of separate out intimacy and love versus sex drive and talk about like what's the primary motivator for modern relationships. And you come out, and I might be botching this, but your general idea is that we are wired to be socially monogamous, so intimate with one person, but not necessarily sexually monogamous. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the one way I think of it, so by training, I'm an anthropologist and evolutionary biologist. And one way I think about it is when we talk all the time about monogamy and monogamous relationships. And as a biologist, we don't use the term on its own. We talk about social monogamy, which is pair bonding, which is the relationship structure, and sexual monogamy, which is the behavior of fidelity. There are two different mechanisms in our brain, and there are two different evolutionary pressures. So the argument, you're exactly right. The argument I made in The Intimate Animal in my new book was really about the pressures for forming intense romantic bonds, that social monogamy that our species engages in all over the world. And for over 4 million years, this capacity to form these intense bonds. Only about 3 to 5% of mammals do this. So the fact that we have the architecture in our brain to do it. In fact, I don't know if you could see behind me is a sculpture of gibbons, and the gibbons are a socially monogamous primate. About 15% of primates and form these socially monogamous bonds. Now, to clarify, that doesn't mean, okay, 3 to 5% of mammals. It's what we then look at, the comparative approach, is we look at what are the other behaviors that those socially monogamous organisms engage in, and do we engage in them? Dual parental care, mutual nest building, mutual territory defense, mutual raising of offspring. So it turns out we see all of that behavior in the human animal. And in fact, this capacity to form these intense bonds. Then the question of sexual fidelity, that becomes a different mechanism because just as we have this intense drive to form connections, and I think for me, intimacy is not just being connected to others, but in humans, we can think about it as being seen and heard and known. So not just that you might have a colleague or a person you see on the bus every day, or even a friend or someone on social media, but do you really have a sense of intimacy with them? Do you really feel that would take you to the hospital, that they would be there if you need them? In fact, most of us have a small number of people who fit that category, even if we have rather large social networks. And then sexual fidelity, sexual monogamy becomes this other lever. And in that sense, it's not a matter of, I think sometimes we think about like, what should we be doing? You should do whatever makes you happy. We could do whatever makes us happy. But when we recognize as a lens that we have the capacity and the desire for these deep bonds, and then also desires for sexual novelty, it doesn't mean that we suddenly have to have sex with a lot of people. Some people might choose that. So some people are in long-term relationships and get bored. Some are in long-term relationships and engage in infidelity because of that desire for variation and novel sexual novelty. Some are in long-term relationships and open their relationship. So it's what we used to call ethical non-monogamy, then consensual non-monogamy. Now we call disclosed or negotiated non-monogamy. And that's one option for some people. We found about 1 in 5 Americans at some point have had a consensually non-monogamous relationship, much lower percentage actively in it.
You said
But
one
then
in
there's the
five.
option that we
One in
found
five of it. Yeah. Well,
in couples that had high degrees of satisfaction in a large study with my colleague Dave Frederick. And what we found is what they do is they pull that desire for novelty into their primary relationship. So they'll do things like take vacations, try new recipes, go on walks, try new sexual behaviors. They take that desire and they pull it into their primary relationship. So they recognize that maybe even subconsciously the desire for that variation, but they say, let's do it in the context of our relationship.
did you lump
Sorry, I
in
cut you
go
off.
for long walks in with all that? I'm not gonna let you get away with that. Uh,
Yeah.
but this reminds me of I think Esther Perel blurbed your book,
Uh-huh.
and I think the sort of her books have been mega successful. I think like
Mhm.
one of them was Mating in Captivity, and she's kind of, if I remember correctly, like famously sympathetic to people who have affairs and kind of
Mhm.
frame them as identity quests. I forget exactly what her conclusion to all that was, but that's kind of what stuck with me. Um, and is this something that like I know that you're not like as you just said, you're not making normative claims. You're just kind of saying like, here is what the tendencies are. This is what we're hardwired for, et cetera. What do we know about either the rise or decline of infidelity, um, and the rise or decline of what you call like this, whatever the words we're using for them now, the ethical non-monogamy?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I was just with Esther last week for Sessions Live. She does an annual conference, and it's the 20th anniversary of Mating in Captivity. So it's a good moment to be thinking about some of those themes. And so when we think about both these sort of rates of non-monogamy and then what people might do to kind of manage that, I think one way that I think about it is we did a study where we looked at motivations for infidelity, and we see that there used to be this framework that what we would call the deficit model of relationships, that particularly when infidelity happened, it was because there was a major problem in your relationship. What we see over and over again in studies is that doesn't explain when infidelity really happens. In fact, that a lot of it is situational. A lot of it sometimes is anger in relationships, sometimes it's your own self-esteem in a relationship, sometimes it's sexual desire. So what that tells me is that the pressure points are not that there's something wrong with the relationship, you're just looking for a way out. Some people are. A lot of it is how do we think about that novelty piece? Now, you're right. I think, so going on long walks, does that solve your relationship problems? No, it doesn't. But when we add up different ways to get novelty, variation. So when you're in a routine and you don't have any variation, that can weigh on a relationship and it can weigh on your desires for something different more than we realize. So is it long walks? Not necessarily, but is it going to a different park? And I say that because we often think go on vacations. My spouse and I try to take vacations a few times a year, go to new places. She'll push me to do things that I often don't want to do. We vacation very differently. I'm like, I want to read a book on the beach. She's like, we're going to go to the cenote and on the other, 2 hours away. Okay. And I'm always glad I did it, but it's not something I would do. Being in that kind of space, pushing us to do novel things, new things. Now, not everyone can afford leaving the country a few times a year. So, how do you think of things that are more attainable across the board? It could be trying new recipes. Now, there's small little things that add up. So, is a new recipe once a month going to fix your relationship if you feel bored? Absolutely not. But if we combine it with a lot of different things and intentionality, really it's about intentionality. It's why lighting candles and mood lighting is good for sexual satisfaction. It's not the smell of the candle, it's making the intention to say, I'm focusing in on this relationship. And then I got myself distracted. Sorry, Robbie. You have to
No, no, no. Well, you
reprompt me.
you prompt me to think about something else, which is
Mhm.
the sort of disparity between what is perceived as normal and the
Mhm.
Kinsey Institute, and this might be an opportunity for you to talk a little
Yeah.
bit about the history of the Kinsey Institute, but what's perceived as normal sexually and romantically versus what's actually happening
Mhm.
and what people want to happen. I know there's a long history at the Kinsey Institute of this, so maybe it's a good time to talk about that, but also like do we still have those deviations where there's one perception of what's quote unquote normal and what people are telling us they want or are doing is quite different than what we think is normal?
I think so. And it can happen across ages and demographics for people, but it also happens in things that we just perceive that what we do in our romantic and sexual lives are normal. And you're right, the Kinsey Institute has been doing this since the 1930s and 40s. So and in some ways the story, the founding of the Kinsey Institute. So in 1938, Dr. Alfred Kinsey was trained at Harvard, then came to Indiana University as a zoology professor in 1920, was this renowned biologist in his own right, but in 1938 was asked to team teach the marriage course. And at the time, more universities were having these sexual hygiene marriage courses. And the students had so many questions, so often about what I want or what I did or where I made a mistake. Is this normal? Are other people experiencing this? What do I do? And the faculty had no answers. There wasn't any research. And in some ways, I think it represents the very best of what a university should be, especially at a time that we're rethinking what university and higher education is. The real promise is you can come as a student, ask a question. If your faculty don't know, they go and find answers. That's what we do as researchers. So the students' curiosity stimulated this unprecedented research study that ultimately turned into 18,000 interviews. They lasted from 3 to 18 hours, often over multiple days. It's still one of the richest data sets on human sexuality ever collected. And there were two landmark books, Sexual Behavior of the Human Male in 1948, Sexual Behavior of the Human Female in 1953. And the institute itself was founded a year before they came out, 1947, to insulate, to create this structure that at the time was a separate nonprofit, to protect it from government interference and to protect the data, frankly, and the people who shared a piece of their lives to be in the studies. we still have that view of when we do studies. How do we protect people? How do we take curiosity and turn that into research questions? But your point, I love because it is still very much a driver of the kinds of studies we do of where this question of what's normal, what do we think is normative? And there's a lot of ways that we take for granted something we do. Sometimes it's cross cultural. So, in a study that we did on kissing, for instance, we know that people value kissing in courtship and that it's important. In one study, 50% of college students said that they knew instantly when they kissed someone, whether they had chemistry or not. And that I think is interesting that people have this idea that it's really telling about something about chemistry with another person. But in fact, we did a cross-cultural study where we looked at 168 cultures using the what's called the human relation area files. And we also wrote to a series of cultural anthropologists. And what we found was that when you actually look cross-culturally, only about 46% of societies engage in romantic sexual kissing. So we take for granted that it's this just normative thing that you do as part of courtship and that it signals a lot of important information about whether you should move forward with a relationship. But in fact, most of the world, the majority technically of the world doesn't do this. And in one case, two anthropologists that we knew wrote back, they were a married couple and they were doing work with foragers in Central Africa, two communities, Aka and Nagunga. I think it was their work with the Aka. And uh, the Barry wrote back and said, "I was in the field one time and I kissed my wife, and one of the community members came up to me and said, 'Well, why would you do that? Why would you spit in your wife's mouth?'" And so we take for granted that what we see is so normative and even pleasurable. Now, okay, let's fast forward to the US today. There's all sorts of examples of that. Some researchers have been documenting the rise of rough sex and choking, for instance, that more young people in particular are treating as just normative behavior. We talked to their parents and grandparents' generation, that's not something that you would think happens in every sexual event and often happens without any conversation or discussion. So there's all sorts of ways that things that we take for granted and how do we fit into that? What the Kinsey reports did at the time were looking at things like, oh, infidelity is way more common than people think. One night stands was more common than people think.
I would imagine
Women
homosexuality
pleasure
back then
outcomes.
for sure.
Yeah, pleasure outcomes like orgasm were much lower, particularly for women than people thought, and well, than men wanted to think. So there was a lot.
Yeah.
I think those become there's still very important questions we need to ask to really see what are people doing in context.
Well, you talk about at various points, and I can't remember if this is in the book, but I've heard you say this that there's certain assumptions beyond the match study
Mhm,
that you and your institute have been uncovering that are just wrong about the
mhm,
way that we think of partners, and feel free to throw more in here. But some of them that I saw here are that there's this perception that breakups are harder for women than men, but you
mhm,
found that men take longer to grieve.
mhm,
One of them is that women are the first to say, "I love you," but I
mhm.
think maybe it's men. Any others that you throw in there?
Yeah. Oh gosh, the myths. There's so many myths. I love those ones. The breakup ones in particular. I mean, there's also that women tend to get bored with monogamy faster than men, even though we tend to all assume that it's
Really?
men that do. Yeah,
Who's
they
more likely to cheat, a man or a woman?
Yeah, so it's such a good question, and I cringe a little bit when it gets asked because it's so hard to answer because it depends on how you define cheating. So you can define cheating as intercourse with someone else, kissing someone else, personal communication with someone else. How often does it happen? When does it happen? So there's a lot of different ways we can think about it. And what's interesting is in the research, there's all these studies, dozens and dozens of studies. We did some of them on the difference between sexual infidelity and emotional infidelity. And this idea that heterosexual men were more upset when their partners engaged in sexual infidelity, women were more upset when their partners engaged in emotional infidelity. This idea there was something important for the relationship. But then there were some newer studies by feminist psychologists that you give them option three and you say, well, I'm upset by both. And everyone says, yeah, I'm upset by both because I know you said it's emotional, but you might as well have had sex with them. Or I know you said it was sexual, but you really didn't look them in the eyes and tell them something emotional. So, what's interesting about that question, what your actual question was with that long preface, is that we're seeing higher rates of women engaging in infidelity. Now, whether that was always the case and we just weren't capturing it in the data, but if you asked this 15 years ago, we'd say men engage in infidelity at higher rates. Today, in the data sets, men and women are pretty close in terms of rates of infidelity. In some ways, it could be because it's also a little bit easier, particularly with social media and with more dual career families. The sort of opportunities and pressure points are more even for men and women now.
Easier to do, but probably easier to get caught, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and the big problem with infidelity is the betrayal. It's the idea, it's the lying, because back to the thing that people want most in a relationship, someone you can trust and confide in, and that was the point that Esther made in her second book, The State of Affairs, was for some people, you could kinda get over the sex, you could kinda get over the communication. It was the part that people struggled with was the betrayal, that the person I thought I could trust, I can't trust. That's what psychotherapists then kinda work with to try and unpack.
It was a funny story I saw, and I get fed these things on Instagram nonstop, so who knows how true this is, but that some woman caught her husband cheating or boyfriend because they have a digital scale. I don't know if you've heard this, and there was a 120-pound person who in the 3 AM or something used their digital scale while the woman was away for travel, and she was like, "Who could it been? My husband's like 200 pounds or a boyfriend." So that was the beginning of the unraveling of whatever that
Yeah.
was. I like the idea of that, whether it's true or not, just that there's new ways to catch people.
Uh-huh.
Um, but this prompts me to wonder though, what can people take away from this idea of the impetus for pair bonding through intimacy
Mhm.
versus sexual, sexual contact or conduct or whatever? Like, is the lesson here potentially that the core of the relationship should be that intimacy and that intimate monogamy, and that we should be less caught up on the sexual monogamy? Is that one
Mhm.
potential conclusion here?
Um, not not I think it's one could take. It's not my framing per se. I think for me, the takeaways are once we have this new lens that we can think about the pressure in our relationships and also the opportunities to cultivate our relationships, it's that we desire these deep, intimate connections. Sometimes that also means we expect too much of our partners. We expect them to be our everything. What psychologist Eli Finkel calls the all or nothing marriage, or this technically what researchers would call the suffocation model of marriage. And that's that you want sometimes your partner to be the person who you love and they love you, and you're sexually attracted to each other, and you see the world together. You have what we call expansion of self because of each other. Take care of Take care of me when I'm sick, then still wanna have sex with me the next morning after I'm sick. So we have these unrealistic expectations sometimes of our relationships. So so this idea of having social monogamy or an intense bond doesn't mean that person has to be your everything. In fact, having friends and a community and a village is quite healthy and helpful, because that can be too much pressure, too much expectation. So there's that part. Then I think the issue on the sexual variation, it's how do we think we want to navigate it? And there's lots of different ways we can, but if we're eyes wide open about it, about saying that there are going to be times you could be deeply in love with your partner, there will be times you're attracted to other people. It doesn't mean that you need to or should or want to have sex with other people or have another relationship, but realizing that you will find people attractive, you will have desires beyond your primary relationship, whether you choose to act on them and how you act on them. So, do you act on them by betrayal, by lying to your partnership? Do you act on them by saying honestly, "Hey, I still love you, but there's something here in our relationship. What are we open to opening? Are we open to thinking of different structures?" Maybe it's also just solo behavior. Maybe you engage in masturbation or you watch pornography. Right? There's lots of ways, but being clear about how you want to manage that in your relationship, I think that's the power of understanding ourselves and understanding the intimate animal within. Or I think the case of what we see in these long-term couples that have satisfaction. Pull the desire into your relationship. Do novel things with your partner. Sexual activity, new positions, mood lighting, taking vacations, just introducing novelty. Learn a new skill. Go take tennis lessons together or golf lessons. My wife's trying to talk me into golfing. I'm a tennis player. She's a golfer. So, how do you just pull new things into your life? That can do more, especially with multiple doses, than we realize.
You mentioned pornography, and the sort of standard line of argument that I hear lately is that
Mhm.
it's massively on the rise and that it is destructive to our society in a number of ways, including what it's doing to young men who are maybe it's contributing to them in particular not taking risks in the dating world. I'm not as steeped in this literature as I would like to be, but what what do we know? I mean, that's like the Galloway argument, right? Like
Yeah.
Scott Galloway. Like what do we know about the trends of pornography usage and the potential pathologies of it, and or advantages, if there are any?
Yeah, and it's fairly complicated. So once you look, I mean, there's a whole journal, there's an academic journal on pornography studies for that reason. They're fairly complicated technical nuances, which make it hard for like when we have these, when we want to just say like, what's the soundbite about it? It's bad for young men. Well, it depends on a whole host of things. So partly, let's just go through some of the caveats with that. Part of the issue is it's bad because we have such a terrible absence of proper sex education, particularly in the United States. This isn't necessarily true everywhere. We just published a study in the International Journal of Sexual Health where we found in a national sample that 44% of adults told us if they just had more sex education, they'd have healthier and happier relationships today. That's a pretty high number. Half of adults saying, if I just had some more information, accurate, curated information, I think I'd have better relationships in my adult life. A lot of sex ed studies focus on adolescents. We were looking at an adult sample. Tell us, looking back, what do you wish you knew? And half are saying, I just wish I knew something. So,
And what's the thing though? I'm curious.
mhm,
Is it a little bit of that, like, if you give anybody an opportunity to be, I wish I knew more about X, you could put anything in there, like finance. I wish I knew
yeah,
more about whatever. I would be better with money. Like,
yeah.
what do people want to know that they didn't get access to?
Yeah, I love that you asked this. So we broke down the domains and we asked about different. Was it about pleasure, which is about fertility, reproduction, contraceptives, consent? And what we found was that pretty low numbers of people were hearing things about pleasure, not necessarily accurate, but they were hearing things about that. They were hearing things about condom use. But as an example, very quickly the debates become political about sex education. Where should it happen, schools or at home? In some ways, in our study, we were kind of interested in not getting tangled up in that. We just want to know what people wish they knew. And where did they learn? If they knew something, where did they learn it? Less than 20% said that they had ever talked about consent with parents or caregivers. So if for folks who think that, sex ed should happen at home versus school or from a professional educator, that's an argument we can have, and we can unpack that and the evidence. The reality is less than 20% of parents were ever talking to their kids about consent. If you can't even talk about consent, if you don't feel you have the language or the knowledge, I mean, all the other stuff is sort of secondary. So that to me just highlights such a big problem and that we get caught up in these debates. Like, where should sex ed happen? Like, 80,
Right.
close to 85% of people are saying that no one talked to them about consent. It's got to happen somewhere.
Yeah, as a personal experience on this, I think you know this about me. I went down
Mhm.
south to start network of
Yeah.
schools, and trying to teach sex ed in the South or anywhere
Yeah.
is very difficult in this politicized environment. And
Mhm.
we had opt out, I think, at least when I
Mhm.
was there, so parents could opt out, and we would send a letter home saying this is what we're gonna do, and it was very difficult even back then, and I think in this environment, it's even worse because I think it's an existential question for a lot of educators, and
Yeah.
we were charters, so we had autonomy from the district in a certain kind of way, but I think a lot of educators are worried that one false step and
Yeah.
you're in the middle of a controversy,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I felt that sort of even then with a greater degree of control.
Mhm.
I do
Yeah.
I do wonder whether it's even gonna get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the first part of your question is that it's partly because the students, the young people have so many questions or misinformation or just trying to figure out themselves or whether they're normal that they're bringing then to a classroom, they're bringing to a teacher. Now, on a college campus, you're a little bit more I don't know if the prepared is the right way. There's more leeway to answer that. You're dealing with adults. There's different regulations about what you say. You can often have a textbook that's going hand in hand with the class. So but it's partly because people wanna know, they don't have questions, they don't have a I mean, if pornography is the source of your sex education because 'cause you're not getting it anywhere else, you're gonna have pretty warped sense of what intimacy looks like, of what sex looks like, what it sounds like, what are the outcomes. I mean, one, you would think people orgasm more than they do. You would think that people are if it lasts longer than it really does, that it sounds different than it really does, that the equipment you have is different than you probably really have, right? All sorts of ways that I meant like, toys, but we
No,
could
I know what you're
unintended.
saying, though, yeah.
And so that it just gives this really distorted sense of what our sex lives should look like. Now, to your question you also asked is how is that impacting interestingly, I guess I should say we did a project with Crash Course, which you might be familiar with. They have a lot of people do like Crash Course AP biology and history, and we partnered with them on a sex education series. And the idea was partly from this study, and it was how do we get outside the debates and politics of whether it should be in school or at home and just make information curated accurate, scientifically accurate information about sex education accessible. So we have a YouTube series that's free to watch with Crash Course on Sex Ed and Kinsey Institute helped curate the background information. It was for that very reason. Like, we just want how do we just get information out there free to the public? Go at your own pace, figure out what you want to learn about. On the pornography piece of how that's shaping people's sense of sex education or their knowledge base, that is for me one of the big questions. Just because it's so depending on what you're watching, and for the most part, what we know from what people are finding online, particularly young people, it tends to be pretty far from reality. And that worries me. To the claims about whether or not it has long-term impacts, we don't really know, and then the impacts are kind of nuanced. So for instance, some couples watch pornography and they see a big boost in sexual satisfaction and relationship satisfaction. There are for some people, there can be benefits depending on the type of pornography that they use. There are some people who can become, I don't really, sexologists don't use the terms like sex addiction and porn addiction because addiction for us has a particular clinical meaning and then a particular clinical treatment. And now there's all sorts of debates that happen about that, but professional, you wouldn't hear that term in a professional conference
Yeah,
with people
I pick up
publishing
what
in
you're
journals.
saying, but I think like in a
Yeah.
colloquial sense, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
what we'd throw around as addiction, meaning
Yeah.
if I were to like, I don't know,
Compulsive. Yeah.
impulsive, you basically can't go a day without doing it. You often have regret about doing it,
Yeah.
right? Like these are types of things you could stack on each other and say we've reached like a colloquial level
Yeah.
of whatever we call
Exactly.
addiction, even if
And
it's not clinical.
some people really actually injuring themselves. Some studies showing that like if you're compulsively watching pornography, most people watch pornography for masturbation and they actually injure their bodies, they injure their
Well,
genitals. And
okay, you remind me. I interviewed the guy. Oh, I can't remember his name. Very interesting reporter from Harper's who wrote the Goon. What is it? What do we call it? Gooning. You know what
oh
I'm
yeah.
talking about? Yeah, yeah. That those kids must be, or guys must be injuring themselves. I mean, they're like masturbating for hours on end,
Yeah.
theatrically. We'll link to that in the show notes because that was a weird one. Well, also, actually, it reminds me, we also had Molly Roden-Winter who wrote Open. We'll
Mhm.
put that in the show notes. She writes about her open marriage. So that was a fascinating discussion. But all right, sorry, continue.
Yeah. So we do know that some people that there are issues there. And then, I for a long time thought, for instance, that people must be getting more ideas about sexual aggression through pornography use. Well, it turns out there's a bit of a nuance in those studies as well that people who watch in particular sexually aggressive pornography, they're more likely to engage in aggressive sexual behavior. The direction of that is a little bit clear of that
Yeah, are
correlation.
they watching
Unclear.
it because they're aggressive to
Yeah.
begin with, or are they learning to be aggressive?
Yeah.
You know,
Probably a little bit of both, but
the whole effect of pornography reminds me. It's just, I think it's part of a larger trend that spans a lot of everything that we bring to relationships, which that includes things like romantic comedies and everything. Like we
Mhm.
have unrealistic expectations of a lot of aspects of relationships because of media in general. And I think we can be alarmist about it, but I think it's part of modern life. Is like,
Mhm.
if you watch, When Harry Met Sally or Notting Hill, you're gonna have a
Mhm.
certain expectation of falling in love.
Mhm.
And if you watch porn, you're gonna have a certain expectation of sex. And I think it's up to people to be reasonable about how they like dissect these things and incorporate it into their lives. And obviously, this
Yeah.
this is where education can come in too.
Mhm.
But I also think like it's just part of modern life to be like, okay, I can parse through, what's Julia Roberts and what's
Mhm.
me versus what's like insert, famous porn star and what's me. And
Yeah.
so at a certain point, I think people just, we can't correct for it. Porn's not going anywhere. So people
Mhm.
just need to know to separate the real from reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the So researchers have used this framework sometimes called love stories, and in that, and I think about that in the context of pornography, is that sometimes we walk around with these love stories or what we think our romantic lives, but also our sexual lives should look like. And on the one hand, that's fine. But to your point, the issue is when we get a little so fixated that we then really chase that love story. And then part of the challenge, whether you're dating, if you're in a relationship, if you're single, but but you then start to compare to this vision and you discount the real opportunities and interactions in front of you. So you could say maybe you have a very fulfilling sex life, but it's not like what I saw in that pornography. Or maybe you have an opportunity to date someone, but that's not the person that I imagined in my love story. So we can really derail ourselves because we get so focused on this idea of what our romantic and sexual lives should be, and we don't focus on the one that we can have that's right in front of us.
It reminds me of something our generation dealt with as it relates to families, because we were
Mhm.
inundated with these sitcoms in the early 90s, Family Matters, Full House, yada, 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 with the sort of perfect family, you know?
Yeah.
And I think I have a theory, which is that this whole millennial blame your parents sort of tendency there is out there. You know, these people go to
Yeah.
like the Hoffman process or whatever, where it's all about like, I mean, I'm cartoon, this might
Yeah.
be a cartoon picture, but so much of modern therapy speak and some of these retreats and sort of new agey thought is it all roads seem to lead back to it's your parents' fault.
Yeah.
And I think, or at least it's a theory, is that some of this dates back to the unrealistic expectations set by these TV shows where,
Mhm.
all these parents, Danny Tanner or whatever,
Yeah.
were like the perfect parents. And then we had our parents who were, you know, chain smoking in our faces and working two jobs and like uh very normal human beings,
Mhm.
and we couldn't square the normal human beings in front of us with the idealized versions on TV. And I think that set us down a path where we started to blame them for not being that perfect ideal.
Yeah, and I think and you're right, and so often those images, they just left out the realities of taking you're away for a business trip, or you had to work too late, or, you're exhausted, or you can't get up in the morning, like, those realities of real relationships and lives. Now, in the best case, those are the things that then having partnerships or having someone in your life that we have an infant at home, and it's like, okay, one of us is too tired in the morning. The whole point of dual parental care is that the other one is there. It's like, go back to bed for an hour. I got this. And so I think those you're absolutely right. I remember I called my mom one day, and I was reading this study about breastfeeding and lactation and reproductive physiology, like what's in milk. There's some interesting human biology studies happening. And I was reading the study, and I called my mom and I just said, I have a question. How long did you breastfeed? And her immediate reaction was like, not more of this parent blaming garbage.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy.
I was like, "Wait, let me explain, let me explain."
On the relationship side of things, I forget what they're called now, but the guys who from College Humor, I
Uh-huh,
forget what their new website is called. Maybe we'll link to it in the show notes, but they have this this series. I think it's called Realistic Sex Scenes or something from movies where they kind of
mhm,
reenact like sex scenes, but what they'd be like in real life and how clumsy and awkward they
mhm,
are. They're pretty funny. I'll see if we can find some and throw them in the show notes.
yeah,
But Justin, this is really wonderful. For folks out there, go out and get The Intimate Animal wherever you get your books. Check out the Kinsey Institute.
yeah.
Is there anything else you want to point folks to?
No, I have social media accounts, but on the Kinsey Institute accounts, we post all of our studies, our educational opportunities, new findings, so we encourage folks to follow and join, and if folks get a copy of The Intimate Animal, I'd love to hear from you and hear what you think.
Well, amazing, man. It's great
Mm.
to see you.
You too, great to be together. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't yet, you can jump on and subscribe to the Lost Debate YouTube. This episode actually is going to appear on that YouTube, and we're now going to start putting out every episode on YouTube and a lot more. And I'll have a lot more to say about that next week. So have a great weekend, everybody.